time aside for us on your, we know you have busy schedules. My name is Tatum Lau. I'm a dual degree in community and regional planning as well as urban design. And I'm involved with the Community and Regional Planning Student Organization Diversity Committee. That's quite a long title, but we're a student-led group. It's Caleb, myself, and Devin over here. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about what we're discussing today, but just quickly, why I'm involved in this student-led. I guess I'm going to be practicing as an urban practitioner in shaping future cities. So for me, there's a sort of personal and professional responsibility that I feel I have to learn and understand the multiple experiences and perspectives of people who inhabit those cities. So that's why I'm involved. And what we'd like to do this year really are sort of three things. The first is to represent and support students at UTSOA, as well as ideas that are not talked about. So feel free to come and talk to us. But that also includes our reading list, which is on our blog, which we'll share with you. And it's a place for us to share our resources on information that's not necessarily in the library or easily accessible. And we'd like to have a dialogue around those things, around those topics. The second is to facilitate dialogue and create safe spaces where we can engage critically and possibly on radical perspectives that aren't brought into the curriculum typically. So sessions like these are important, but we're also interested in having much more intimate, micro-level conversations, which Caleb will talk about. Our first one's coming up on Friday this week. And then our last goal is to partner and collaborate. So there are a lot of resources on campus and in the city, but how do we bring that to this school, to the School of Architecture, and reflect on those perspectives from the view of the built environment. So, with that, just let me introduce the panel to you. We've got Elizabeth Danzy, the interim dean. Our new emerging scholars in race and gender in the American built environment, Andrea and Anna. Devin is a dual degree in CRP and Latin American Studies. And you know Anju and Sadie, who are the Feminist Design Collective at the School of Architecture. After they've introduced their work and themselves, we'll have 20 to 30 minutes for an open forum. So write down any questions you may have or things that you'd like to bring up. And with that, I'll pass on to Caleb.
Thank you all for coming. My name is Caleb Roberts. I'm a first year doing community and regional planning. Like Tatum said, I am a research assistant for diversity here, working with Dr. Oden. I'm so glad to be able to do this work. Tatum touched on why she cared about diversity, why this was important to her. For me, I understand that in planning fields, for a great majority of the history, diversity, people like myself, a lot of people here weren't included in those plans, weren't included in how we shape our cities, how we shape the built environment. And so it's important to me to understand that framework as I move forward, and it's something that I really wanted to learn, and I'm glad I can do this work to make sure that whatever I plan, in what capacity, that I'm having that framework in my mind. Tatum alluded to a conversation we'll have this Friday. I would like all of you to come. It's a brown bag conversation. It'll be Friday at 10:30, right in the room here, 3.118, Friday at 10:30. We'll be going over some of our goals, what you expect from this year, and some things that we've been working on. But we really want to hear from you about some of the things that you think are great ideas and how you would like to be involved in this year in our diversity work. We would love to hear from you. I know you all have great ideas. So we're going to move on to the panelists. They're going to kind of introduce to you their work. I'm going to tell you that there are three kind of questions that they had to answer here. One being, what first got you interested in this topic and how has that evolved? Second, briefly share your work, past, present, and future, and how do you hope this work will shape the built environment? So we're going to start right down here, and they'll all have a few minutes to talk.
Okay, thanks so much. Why am I interested in this? I've been interested in this when I first decided to become an architect, because for me, being an architect it's a service profession, and I took that literally. I really meant it. And I think that you cannot be an effective professional, really, without addressing these issues. That it's an obligation, it's an ethical obligation that we have to be thinking about these things. So I'm going to say like one thing, and then I'm going to pass the microphone on, because I really want to hear what you all have to say, what you're thinking, what you're wondering about. When I was a graduate student in the late 1980s, early 1990s, I got together with a few of my classmates, 2 other classmates, and we decided we were going to put together a journal called Architecture and Feminism, and it was going to be a quarterly journal. We got Deborah Burke agreed to be our advisor. She's now the first female dean at Yale, just starting this year. She's wonderful. She has a fantastic practice in New York. You probably know who she is. So she was our advisor, and we sent out a call for papers, and we got over 100 submissions, and we ended up putting together a book called Architecture and Feminism. One book, not a journal, one book, in 1996. And I'm talking about this because since I'm the oldest one in the room, no doubt, and certainly up here, I want to say what was happening in 1992, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then I'm going to pass it on, because I think it's a kind of reference that I come from. What was my reference, what was my influence, or the women and men and people of my generation, what was happening at that time. So I'm going to read just like 3 sentences, and it's from the introduction to the book Architecture and Feminism. Feminism, especially as it's often used in mass culture at that time, is an unpopular word, raising as it can the specter of the spinster, the burnt-out supermom, the childless career woman, and of course the man-hater and the lesbian. So we wanted to use that word, feminism, because it had gone way out of popularity, and it had a lot of negative connotations, and maybe it does today. I don't know, something to talk about. Many women were seeking acceptance in the field of architecture, but they wanted to disassociate themselves from talks of gender difference. And today, and I don't know how much we'll talk about this, but gender consciousness at the time, and I think we're still thinking about those things, at the time, gender consciousness was really formed around being a woman, a female woman architect, the name woman architect. And there was a lot of division about whether it was a good thing or a bad thing to be a woman architect, or maybe it was better just to be an architect. So again, this question of gender consciousness was very much with us. One of the reasons that people wanted to disassociate themselves of gender difference was to escape the, quote, to be tarred by the brush of femaleness or female otherness by being contaminated by all things female. So that was at the time there was this question, and it was the book addressed these issues both in the kind of theoretical world with projects and essays by sociologists and others, but it also addressed it in the practice of architecture. That question that we talk about a lot, and we're still talking about it, where are all the women when they, at the higher levels of practice? Where are they in academia? What happens? Then when they've been in practice or around for 10 years, 20 years, they either disappear. So there's that's still around, it's still a question, it's still something I think that we grapple with. But I'm really most interested for me is this, maybe this question of how relevant is any of this today? I don't know, that was 25 years ago, that was a long time ago. And I wonder how relevant, if any of it, is today. I'm interested to hear what you all think about that. I'm going to pass the microphone.
I actually think it's really relevant. Because when you said those years, 92, 93, I was thinking about my own sort of journey to where I am now. And my original foray into academia was as an undergraduate who was focused on studying the political power of women of color in the United States. So this was sort of a time when there was a lot of literature that wasn't only about feminism, but it was the intersection of race and feminism and class and sexuality. There was a growth of queer studies and people being like, whoa, is that actually a thing? And so I think it's relevant in that it is only until now that we're so forthrightly talking about it in the context of the built environment, which obviously makes it relevant still, because it has taken that long for us to be so open and forthright about integrating it into this discipline the way we are. So why and when have I started to become interested in diversity? I've had a sort of, believe it or not, embodied experience of diversity. But in the terms of, in the field of planning, which I predominantly worked in planning and community development in governments, and as a consultant before I came to the PhD program, I found that people had an idea that planning was about a few things. It was about pluralism, it was about integration. All of these things that we take for granted are the goals of us as planners. How do we get together and synthesize a lot of disparate ideas and synthesize them into something that's meaningful, to make a space work, to make sense of space, to be sustainable. And then I was actually doing work out in the community. I'll use, for example, Houston. And I would talk to people from predominantly historically African-American neighborhoods, 3rd Ward, if you're from Houston, that's familiar, 4th Ward, Sunnyside. And people would say, I'm not really interested in trying to get a bunch of other people to move in here. I want the resources my community deserves. And I want the history of my community validated and supported and respected. And it wasn't anti-white, it was an affirmation of what it took to build their community, the origins of their community. And so when I would sit in on meetings in the housing department, for example, where we would look at, how we were going to spend HUD funds, Housing Urban Development Funds. And I would hear these discussions about, we've got to make sure we don't over-concentrate this here. We've got to make sure we don't have an over-concentration of that here. It wasn't consistent with what were the priorities and worries and concerns of the people I was talking to every day. And at the same time, I was having a very personal experience of learning about my own roots in historically African-American communities that were founded just after slavery. And so that came together to really spur me to want to spend full time thinking about how we can develop planning curriculum, planning theory, and just the practice of planning to reflect more the priorities and the needs and the desires of the people who are often planned on top of, okay? These are people that planning happens to. And in the process, I then shifted to focus my work on studying these types of communities. And what I found is that there's a whole history and a tradition of planning, of placemaking. And so I'm very interested in diversifying still planning, not just in terms of making sure that the actual practitioners look like us, but then we realize we're not only the only practitioners there are. All the practitioners aren't just in government or at fancy consulting firms. There's a whole tradition of planning and placemaking that we have to integrate into our understanding of what planning is. And so that's...
Okay, so I guess I would say that my interest in this really evolved for me in my move from architecture to planning. So I originally come from architecture and then did my graduate work in planning. And when I was just starting my dissertation was when Katrina hit, and I had been living in New Orleans. And so my research became really centrally focused on the layers to how Black residents were prohibited from returning to neighborhoods and the racialized recovery of the city. And really trying to understand how different folks understood planning. So there was about 10 years of planning after Katrina. And with residents in all neighborhoods really involved, both at the neighborhood level, creating their own neighborhood plans for their visions for the future, but then also participating in a huge number of city-led processes. And what I found was that there were real differences in how whites were viewing the recovery, and they viewed the recovery as not racialized at all, that race had nothing to do with who was coming back or who, had access to resources, whereas Black residents felt incredibly vulnerable in the redevelopment sort of projects and proposals for the city. And so that worked. So that was my dissertation, and then I moved into teaching, and I think I want to echo Andrea's comments about, for me, this work is really central in training planners. So what I think of as my role as, sort of as teaching planning students who will one day go out into the field and make real policies and approve development projects that are on the backs of communities of color and are what we see now are often leading to a lot of displacement in this move back to the city by whites. So for me, that's really central to my work as in teaching, but then in my own research, it's also kind of morphed into understanding how what we're seeing in New Orleans in terms of the vulnerability of historic Black neighborhoods being displaced by gentrification and this real hyper-development in New Orleans post-Katrina, we're also seeing across the country. So in these historic Black neighborhoods like Bronzeville, Chicago, Harlem, New York, Sweet Auburn, Atlanta, Houston, we're seeing a massive amount of displacement in communities of color. And for me, that's really central to the work of planning right now. And planning has played a role both in creating these segregated communities, creating decline and disinvestment, and then also bringing back residents into the city, but not to the benefit of folks who've lived there for a long time. And so my kind of goal in both in my teaching and my research is always to highlight the role of planning in doing that and trying to understand how we can be more inclusive in terms of making better policy that doesn't lead to these same outcomes, but in different sort of built environments.
All right. So hello, I'm Devin. I guess I'll start by saying what I do now, what I study now, and kind of certain moments or certain factors leading to where I am right now. So in terms of research, my research is empirically based in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. And so I study the role of urban planning historically in creating the geographies of race, gender, and violence in the city of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. And so, but in particular, I'm really interested in the ways in which Black LGBT youth, how they respond to and negotiate these forms of gendered anti-Black violence, and also what are their own practices of placemaking, and kind of those spatial practices, what does it mean for planning, and kind of implications for planning and diversifying what we mean by planning, is what Andrea and Anna was saying in a way. So that's kind of what I study, and so sometimes it seems kind of random. So I came into planning from a very social science academic kind of track. So I started out as a geographer. Anybody who knows me knows I'm a geographer. I always talk about that. So thinking about, so in other words, thinking about people and those dynamic relationships between people and our environments, both built, social, natural, et cetera, et cetera. So that's kind of how I think about the world, and this makes sense. Thinking about the built environment and also space as a kind of framework to think about politics and how politics take place throughout the city. So I would say most importantly, not only in academic work, but as I graduate later on, I enter professional practice for the first time ever, which I'm excited about. But thinking about how do I not only do work that's merely about Black people and marginalized Black people, but how do I do work that is reflexive and at the same time centers the agency and visions of marginalized Black people, in particular my work with Black queer youth. And being a Black queer youth myself identifies as that. So what does that mean? So when it comes to planning, over the years, as a critical geographer, I've come to know planning, kind of the bad side of planning, and seeing how the bad side of planning materializes through built environment. And coming from Cleveland, a Rust Belt city, anybody who's from that region, those types of declining cities can relate in a way. And so, that's my train of thought. But yeah, so I'm thinking about the bad side of planning only. For me, planning has been really essential in thinking about kind of what informs Black people's sense of place and kind of daily struggles, and thinking about how planning and policy has been really instrumental in that. And so I'm really critical of planning, but I'm also thinking about what can we salvage with planning, and what has planning done that has actually provided access to resources and has kind of helped facilitate Black folks in struggles to at least try to live life and to respond to violence and negotiate with violence in the city. So I would say that, and when it comes to Brazil, I would say I first went to Brazil in 2011 and seeing how campaigns, branded campaigns, and also different planning initiatives in the city of Rio for the mega events, so the Olympics and also the World Cup. And so on the one hand, seeing everything wrapping up for the mega events, on the other hand, seeing and starting to become aware of racial violence and also anti-Black violence, specifically gendered towards women and folks who identify as more feminine, who express more feminine gender identities. So seeing economic inequality, seeing racial inequality and violence, and at the same time seeing how Rio has really kind of built itself up as a global gay tourist destination. So seeing all these things and seeing how is this kind of gay-friendly placemaking, also seeing how Black Brazilians are trying to navigate throughout urban spaces in the city, and seeing how economic inequality kind of sets the tone for that as well. And so what does it mean to be Black and LGBT, and to really negotiate or to navigate a homophobic landscape that's segregated by race and class? And so what does that mean? And seeing how in a lot of ways kind of LGBT-friendly places or gay-friendly places, according to tourist campaigns, in a lot of ways those spaces exist because they're a result of dispossession of poor Black residents in the past and also in the present. So really thinking about the contradictions of diversity in a very mainstream sense, and those are the things that I'm really interested in, which I think would be productive. So I'll stop there.
Hi, I'm Sadie. Andrew and I are the Feminist Design Collective, as Tatum mentioned. So what we started as was, I guess, just two very disgruntled architecture students, disappointed by the lack of representation of women, not just in the field itself, like where are women architects going, what's happening after we graduate, but even within courses in precedents where we're taught, the really important historical architects and important architecture, and very little conversation or education surrounding the role of not just women, but anybody who's in any way marginalized in society, and really only learning about like old white men in architecture. And just thinking like there's got to be something better, there's got to be a better way for us to be educated, because it's not just, for us it's frustrating and upsetting to not really see ourselves represented at all in the field, but it's also a way to move towards a more ethical design if in our education we are teaching people about other architects, other people that we're designing for, and thinking about this more inclusive narrative that happens in architecture school that we just didn't see happening here at all, and thinking about how that could change, and also accountability and all of these other things. And so we really just, at the core, we want to foster more like ethical design and ethical design spaces. We want to also foster a community in which designers of all kinds are welcome and are represented and are not in any way like threatened at any point in their professional lives, that they might like not be making enough money, or they might not be performing well enough and they drop off and decide to join another field. And I would say that, do you want to talk about the work that we are doing with AIA now? Okay, so yeah, we're doing some really exciting stuff now with the women at AIA Austin that Andrew can tell you about.
So there's actually an event coming up this February 2017, put on by the women in the AIA. There's a working group, and there's a UT component to the this exhibit that's going to be happening, along with several different lectures and luncheons regarding women in architecture, and I would say feminism as well. And so we're right now working on the UT piece. Last semester, under Elizabeth Danzy's mentorship, we have been interviewing several local female architects who work in very different aspects of design and also are varied in age. And those interviews have been recorded, and we're hoping to somehow showcase them and present them in a compelling and interesting way, which if anybody's interested in helping us, we're still working on it. So yeah, that's what we're working on. I think I don't really want to talk anymore because I know people probably have questions, want to hear more from these people on the panel. So yeah, thanks.
Well, thank you. Thanks for all those comments. I think as someone who's in both fields, in the sort of architecture and planning side, and maybe this question is for Anna, and I'm not going to hog the mic, but it sounds like there's the sort of role of architects, because their clients aren't necessarily the public and communities, is a little bit more elusive than with planners who are, constantly engaged with the public. So what is the role of these dialogues for architects who aren't working for the public? I'm just going to leave that question sort of to float. But what I might do is get 2 or 3 comments or questions and then come back to the panel. So, anyone want to go first?
My name is Hillary. I'm a first-year CRP student, and something that my peers have heard me talk about lately, and I think, Devin, you can speak to this, is Black Lives Matter. And I've been thinking a lot about the history of white ownership and protecting white ownership in this country, and how the police state, I'll say, define that as police force or police unions or what have you, are enforcing that sense of white ownership, I think, and so by extension, it's sort of like the white streets, right? Like, we're protecting the white streets, we're protecting the white sidewalks. Be curious to hear what your thoughts are about the built environment and sort of like protection of whiteness in the built environment, if you will.
Trying to figure out where to start. So, maybe to kind of ground in the built environment. So, I'll start this way. So, for me, a reason why I went into planning, Latin American studies, which people who know Latin American studies, quite different politics many times from School of Architecture in terms of what we're going to do kind of once we're out, what we're going to do with our education. But I would say the reason why I've been planning is I feel that planning, it's clear that planning and design they're clearly implicated in daily acts of violence, whether it's state-sanctioned violence, and also just kind of the state of Black communities throughout the U.S. and also the Black diaspora. So for me, I'm starting to see this even more and more as I go throughout my planning education. So for example, seeing how planning is implicated when it comes to even street lighting. So especially when it comes, so Simone Brown talking about like Black surveillance or surveillance of Black bodies. And so for example, thinking about how lighting or how streets are lit, in certain places streets are lit more so in Black and low income and community of color, especially around public housing developments. So thinking about how does that facilitate state surveillance of Black people, and also why is that a taboo subject in planning? Like, I feel like, so for me, I talk about these things, I'm making these connections, but sometimes, I feel like it's hard to have these conversations because either I'm, sometimes I think I'm being too theoretical or, but there's a point where I'm thinking, I'm not being too theoretical. I think it's important to make these distinctions or make these connections that, and these connections that have, actually, I would argue colonial legacies when it comes to, thinking about the role of the state in role planners, and role designers also, in making these precarious conditions in which people kind of live and struggle to live.
So I want to say two quick things, and I'm going to pass the mic. But I would say two things I see, at least in my research in New Orleans, is it's really hard for me to kind of unpack the social from the spatial. I think they're really interrelated. And a lot of times, so what we see like in public housing reform under Hope 6 and neighborhood choice is a new idea of the built environment, right? And we've seen this kind of take place in the last 11 years in New Orleans. And so there's this idea of bringing back a different type of built environment and mixing incomes and mixing races. And what we see is this, in New Orleans, the porches are really important for socializing, and the social space of the street and the stoop are incredibly important. And so although that got adapted into the built environment of public housing reform in New Orleans post-Katrina, we see a lot of policing of behavior. So residents are actually not allowed to sit and hang out on their stoops or socialize. The stoops are ridiculously small, so you can't have any sort of ownership of that space. And so there's this kind of contradiction built into the way the built environment is actually being policed. And then the other example, I think, and a lot of my work tries to kind of use, I think colonialism is a really important root that planning doesn't often link back to, but also sort of white supremacy and white privilege and the way that planning sort of expands that in its work. And I see that in the expansion of like fair housing and affordable housing prohibitions in white communities in New Orleans, whereas like black communities that tried to have say they didn't want multifamily housing were not allowed to exclude it. And usually multifamily housing raises a lot of tensions no matter what. But planning kind of really sort of uncritically adapted and allowed white communities to kind of prohibit multifamily housing and affordable housing. And so planning is really active in protecting white geographies in the city. At least that's what I've seen in New Orleans.
So there's two pieces to this for me. There's one, what they've been talking about, which is sort of unpacking the ways that whiteness has, for lack of a better word, colored planning. And that is how much of planning is basically an exercise of the white gaze, on space and shaping space and built environment. And then the other piece, which is what I'm very much concerned with, is how do we visualize free black space? Where do we find examples of it? And then how do we replicate it? And then how do we build it? What does that look like? What does a liberation-based planning look like? These are theoretical questions, but for me, for what my calling is to do that work of finding the evidence of free black space, which is a lot of what I do in my both historical and ethnographic work around African American settlements and the diaspora associated with them and their preservation practice. But then the other piece is then, okay, how do those pieces then turn into ways that people then decide to engage in self-policing? How did we self-police? What is community post-police? Which are discussions people in Black Lives Matter have all the time. And if we're in planning and we're not even willing to go to post-police, not to say that's the solution, but to say that we're having that discussion, right? And so I think those two things have to happen at once. One is, why do we unpack all the colonial strains and the dominance of whiteness in planning? And then the other piece, which is the visioning and the centrality of liberation and affirming blackness in our vision of what a free space is and free communities are.
I'll just say one or two words about this. I'll bring it over to architecture because I'm an architect. That the profession of architecture is, at its roots, its history, is a white man, privileged man's profession. So if you go all the way back to who built and who builds now, who is around the table when the decisions are made about what gets built and who builds it and how it gets built, these are conversations that I think until there's a wider range of peoples around the table, that the environment won't look different. It will continue to look white privilege. And I think it's understandable, actually. I think it's understandable because it's rooted in, at least for architects and architecture, it's rooted in our history. And and I think it continues. And I think in some ways it's not intentional, but we have a legacy that I think we have to be very intentional about changing it. And that's why I'm interested in this. I don't think it's something that will just take care of itself or evolve over time. It would take too long. We would all be, it won't happen. It won't happen at all. I think we have to be very deliberate, very intentional about asking these questions and about finding solutions that are aimed exactly at what we believe the solution ought to be looking like by who. So I think discussions like this are important. I think addressing this question of white privilege, whatever that might mean to different people, and really the history and the legacy, at least of architecture. Why does the profession look like it does now? In some ways, I think architects are losing ground. They're not the ones sitting around the table. I'm glad planners are. That's good. Architects should be more. But if you look at, all you have to do is look at popular magazines, popular journals, about what gets published, who's publishing, where. It's a very deeply ingrained reality that I think is changing, and I'm optimistic about it, but I won't keep talking.
Well, we could take some more questions. Okay.
It's fine. Just really quick. Also, for anybody who's interested in this, so what Andrew was talking about, what is, I don't know, like how would for example, free black space look like in the social and built environment? And so, for example, the Movement for Black Lives just released a policy platform, which has six kind of themes here. And so a vision for Black Lives, policy demands for Black power, freedom, and justice. For me, this is a clear, kind of tangible kind of roadmap, at least a more pragmatic roadmap, that I think planners should be really critically engaging with, taking it seriously. And so for me, a dream course would be like to go through, like this will be the document we go through and like coming up with proposals, given the guidelines from Movement Black Lives. Right? I'm just saying, I mean, no pressure. But, so for example, like end the war on Black people, reparations, so for example, redlining, like for which reparations are made, redlining, divest versus invest, economic justice, community control over resources and budgeting, etc., and political power. For me, this is like planners can clearly be in these conversations, and so that's kind of one thing that I like. It's like a dream for me. So kind of, I'll shut up now. But if anyone wants to do it, then feel free.
Thank you for your response. I'm Jose. I'm a third-year dual degree in CRP and Latin American Studies, and my question is a little similar related to kind of what Devin was talking about, but can you talk about, and this is for anyone in the panel, about some pragmatic, even tangible, not necessarily solutions, but things that you've done in your own work, not just research, but previous, about how to combat some of the issues of feminists and kind of as a dirty word, or with racism, discrimination. Just, I guess, when people come to discussions, panels, a lot of times have felt like, well, what can I do? What I feel to blame, I feel uncomfortable, et cetera, So can you talk a little bit about some pragmatic, practical things that we can do as audience members?
So I can't. Well, I'm not gonna answer it. But so putting these more critical views and perspectives in practice, like whether in professional practice or just like kind of daily practice, right?
Sure. So obviously not professional practice. We're still students, but I think, and I think I'm in a very similar place as you. And like, you know, the first step is finding, or for me, it was like finding a community and finding a goal. And something that I think was really helpful for Anju and I was trying to narrow down into something tangible. So saying like there are all these problems, but what's this like one thing we can grasp? And for us, this project that we're working on now, where we're interviewing women in Austin and we're highlighting their work within the community, is a way that we're able to provide visibility not just to ourselves, but then to be able to present that work to other people, and then hopefully, you know, the community gets larger and more people are interested. And so I think it's really powerful to even just have one other person to work with, but really just think about like something that's manageable for you to do and that would help you feel better, and chances are there are a lot of other people who would benefit from that too.
Couple of things. I wouldn't settle, so don't settle and make demands. Both of those things. Don't settle for what you think is inevitable, because it's likely it's really not. So I would say don't settle and really demand for things to be different. I think there's actually a lot you can do. Here's just a sort of pragmatic example that's just straight. Colleagues of mine who graduated when I did from architecture school, they have their own firm, and they decided that these are white guys my age, and they decided that in order to do the best work, create the best buildings, the best communities, they really had to have a much different look in their office. The people in the office doing the work had to look a lot different than them, in order to really create a genuine, have a really authentic understanding of a much more complex and much more rich world. That unless they were hiring people, architects, planners, interior designers, those who were hiring them, they weren't doing a good enough job as architects and designers. And I admire that. So that's a top-down solution. It's a recognition on their part that they have an obligation and that their work is better, and it's true. It is better. There's a much deeper understanding of the problems and the projects that have to be addressed. So I think embracing that and being a part of that. Go work for a firm where the profile of the firm looks more like the kind of profile you want to be in. Firms are looking for really, really good people who have a lot of ability, a lot of talent. So you don't have to go to work for a firm that you don't feel really good about in its totality. And that's what I would start there. And I think there is actually a lot you can do. Don't settle and make demands.
Okay, I like that. So there's something I have done, and then I'll give you two things that I'm doing right now. The thing that I have done is that I've looked at diversity and difference, particularly in engagement and priority setting, which is the part of planning where I think it's where it's hard to escape that colonial legacy of feeling like a missionary and you're going in and you're asking for inclusion. It's just a very tenuous, difficult piece. And so what I did is I tried to do some paradigm shifting. When I was working for the city of Houston, we had to get people involved in how we disseminated money, and every year we had everybody come to City Hall, give their input. So if you live way out in the boonies, if you live in the north side, if you live here, you're not, it's the same suspects who keep coming every time. So I said, that's fine. We'll still have one here. Let's have two more. Let's have one at Sunnyside and let's have one at Fifth Ward. Let's bring people to have food. Let's have, so, you know, not that that was the first time anybody's ever had food or had a meeting in the community, but there are things that we keep doing the same old way, and we take for granted that that's the way we always have to do it, and those are those small opportunities we can take to shift. Okay, so that's one small thing. The two things I'm doing right now are in coaching and mentoring people who may be characterized as non-traditional students and encouraging them to pursue PhD careers. And I do this online, and it's a peer-to-peer coaching online group called Is a PhD for Me? And so you're older, let's say you're an older student at this time, that means 35 plus, or you're queer, or identify as queer, or you're an older black woman, or you're low income, people who don't know the language of being in school or getting into school. People who may not have even heard of planning as an opportunity or that there's a planning PhD. So this is something that I just decided to do. It's not going to change the whole color and makeup of PhDs in the country, but it is something that I hope grows, and there's people in the group who are coaching other people. And I think it's, you got to take those opportunities to believe that you have something that can support someone else. We may not think we do, but we do. And the other thing that I'm doing right now is working on a museum preservation project. It's an archive project where I'm archiving stories. So it's research, but it's also building a foundation for other people to do research based on what I'm learning now. So I'm collecting African American planning practice and foundational stories and turning it into an archive. So any and everybody can start to do this work. So right now, it's a little pet project with Institute of Texts and Cultures, and then later, this is a larger endeavor that may really come into fruition way past the time I'm even alive. But that's the other thing, think long range, how you're beginning something really small that can become bigger later.
I would just add, I think one thing I always tell my students is that, part of planning, we're so steeped in the tradition of like inclusive planning and participation, and I think, I feel like I'm always the dooms sort of voice in the room, but, when I teach, but I think it's really important for students who are going to be practicing planners, that they are really critical even of that work, right? So the impulse, I think, is a good one, but we often do it in very poor ways. That can be, in the end, very exclusive and very paternalistic. And so I think what I always say to students, and I talk a lot about this like in our classes, is that there are folks out there doing the work. They're doing planning work, they're doing community work, they're doing everyday sort of survival work, they're doing placekeeping, they're doing all of this, and they have two things. They have a critique that's probably better than any critique a scholar could make of the structural conditions that shape their lives, and they have a vision. And so you don't have to invent that vision, and you probably should really understand the critique. And I think that that for us, it's like opening up what we consider inclusion and what we consider kind of data, in a way, for lack of a better word, is to know that communities are producing visions all the time. They're doing this work, and planners have to key in and support that work in a better way. And one example I'll just give, and this is a really dated example, but it always strikes me, is in New Orleans, very typical, in the 60s, there was a highway that was constructed through the middle of the historic black community, and it decimated this rich business and cultural corridor that was really central to the Treme neighborhood and the Treme way of life. And post-Katrina, there's been a real revival of talking about taking down I-10, and residents who are really savvy after 10 years of planning, were pushing back on that, because their concern was not that they didn't want to kind of re-knit the community, but that it was done in a way that would only further gentrification and displacement. But they could point to a plan that they had come out with. So the highway went up in 1968, and in 1975, a group of community activists and community architects, people from the community, put together a plan and demanded taking down I-10. So this is like from the 70s. And this just incredible vision about what they needed in their community, which was jobs, which was more resources. So it's all there, right? And I think that I always want to remind students that, like, folks know what they need, and folks have a vision for this world, and it's us doing the job of better supporting it.
We've only got 5 more minutes, so we could take 2 more questions.
Mine is more of a comment than a question, but it might end in a question. My name is Devin Pina. I'm an architect at Page Sutherland Page. I just became licensed a month ago, and I'm the third licensed Black woman architect in Austin. Like, there's only 3. And I think there's only 7 Black architects in general in Austin, which is ridiculous. But I mean, it's an accomplishment, but at the same time, it just totally just exposes the disparity. And because when I got licensed, my first thing was like, okay, here's the platform, let's use it. So I reached out to KUT and had an interview there, and now I'm just like going to like Boston Public Radio and all these places.
Yeah, I saw it on Facebook.
Isn't it crazy? It's nuts. But it's like, it doesn't have anything to do with me. It's like, going back to your question, like when you are in school and you know there's a disparity, and whether you have the privilege that already gives you a little bit of a platform, or you have to build your own, it's just important to use it. And I've had so many people reach out to me just because of that. And there's also these Alibi X conversations that this guy, Jordan Sterling, he's in tech in Austin, a Black guy, he puts together these conversations so we can have more cross-disciplinary conversations about what's going on in the Black community, and those will be airing pretty soon, but they're Austin homegrown. And I guess to end on a question, what do you all think, what efforts can we make to kind of grow that number of architecture designers, planners, everybody in that community here in Austin, while we have a decreasing or at least stabilized number of African Americans in general?
Congratulations. Do you want to teach here? No, something that the American Institute of Architects is doing, and this is what I mean by it has to be conscious, deliberate, and it's got to be doable and workable, and it's got to happen. They're going into inner cities and talking to elementary school, middle school kids about what architects do and what planners do. So part of the problem is they're not exposed to what, they don't know. We just don't know. Not everyone has access. And if you don't have access, then you're not going to be able to participate. So it's very simple in a way. It's very straight, but it hasn't really happened. So I'm excited about this initiative that they've started. And I'm going to pass it on to somebody else has a comment.
Okay, I'm going to take... And as I'm walking, I'm going to take this opportunity to say, come and join us for our monthly brown bags and our conversations, and we'll be bringing in the Gender and Sexuality School to do an allies workshop, so come and join that. Those are things you can do in the next couple of weeks.
Cool. Hi, I'm Greg, first year CRP. My question, I guess, is what can we do to change the climate of what we learn as students? Because, quite frankly, I'm tired of learning about old white men planning, and we don't necessarily get to learn about planners that maybe look like us or people that made planning for us while we're going through this process. Because a lot of the time, it feels like planning is just undoing stuff that was done to us versus stuff that was done for us. So I'm kind of like, I want to learn more about maybe something that was done for us, or what can we do to get more information on that kind of things. So I can, I guess, I don't know, maybe have an idol in planning, because I don't really have anybody to look up to right now. There's no way that looks like me.
Okay. I can just say what I'm doing. So, it's interesting, the more critical and vocal I am about my criticism of planning, the more students of color and queer students of color have come to me asking about planning. Like, the more vocal I am about, there are very clear colonial legacies of violence that planning perpetuates. And I like talking about that. And I don't think it should be a taboo. And everyone else is like, yeah, that's not that. But that's also I want to be in planning. So that's why I think it should be a taboo, because last year I talked to over 10 different students who had similar politics and wanted to get in planning because they saw that it gave us really valuable skill sets and kind of ways into certain institutions we couldn't normally, but also more primarily in terms of where you are in class. one particular class, I was adamant on kind of introducing different paradigms, as Andrea was mentioned before, like different paradigm shifting. So talking about certain planning history with a capital H. I was like, okay, well, here's a different type of planning. What about the 10-point program from the Black Panther Party? That could be seen as community planning. Why don't we talk about that? Or we have this platform that just came out like 2 months ago. That seems like planning to me, in policy reform. So I'm like, these are alternatives that they don't know what they're talking about. These hundreds of pages of like concrete policy recommendations. Like, for example, I'm forgetting things, I'm blanking. But I swear, they're really good things in this thing. So, and also I've noticed that if you find yourself being the only one mentioning that, definitely I feel other students who say they're allies should then kind of make it more effort to call on you and like refer to the idea that you said, or say, as Greg was saying, oh yeah, that is a really interesting idea about the Black Panther Party, this is an example. But having students who say they're allies actually speak up on your behalf, because that was very frustrating for me my first year, because people telling me like a week later, like, I loved your comment, but there were crickets when I was shot down because it wasn't really planning, So not just like what you can do, but what other people who say that talk the talk. So yeah, that's all I had to say.
I would definitely agree with like everything you just said. There's a lot of what I was already gonna say, but I would again kind of go back to what Elizabeth was saying, where make demands and don't settle. Also, like, we're all paying for education here, and I think it's important to make demands of our educators, and that can be as small as calling somebody out or calling out a professor in class. Like, that's okay, and I think all educational environments, at least the ones I've been, don't encourage that exactly, but I think that's something we need to foster as a school, is an active learning environment, not just for us, but for our educators, because that's where it's going to change. So that's all.
Okay, well, I think our time is up, so thank you to the panel. It sounds like we need to continue this conversation. 1 hour is not enough, but I know people have to leave, so thank you very much, and thank you to the panel.